Good morning to my Boundless friends. My name is Bethany Kempfert from Boundless LLC, Myofascial Release and Physical Therapy. And as promised, I'm coming to you this morning to talk about strengthening your core. Now, don't expect this to be a big gym workout, anything tough. There'll be no sit-ups involved because I truly believe that is not the ideal way to strengthen your core. That might be a great way to give you six-pack abs and make your tummy look really great, but it isn't necessarily going to do anything to make your body feel better. Because a lot of times when we do something like sit-ups, we aren't really working at stabilizing our core. We're working at strengthening specific muscles. And when we talk about strengthening our core, the important thing is not that you have necessarily specific muscles that are strong. It's important that you have muscles that work together. That's the key. So let's talk just a little bit about what is your core exactly. And we're going to get into exercises you can participate in just a minute here. Here's my little friend. So typically when people are talking about the core, they're talking about this space between the rib cage and the pelvis that really doesn't have a whole lot of support. If you look at that, the only thing that's going on in that area in terms of bony structures is this very, very mobile spine. So when we're talking about the core, we're saying, you know what? We need a lot of muscles participating together in order to keep this area between the rib cage and the pelvis stabilized, considering it's just connected to this very mobile spine. And that takes a lot of muscular cooperation in order to do that. So you don't have to remember all of this, but just for your knowledge, some of the muscles that are involved in the core are, of course, multiple levels of abdominal muscles, ones that run up and down and sideways this way and sideways this way, and ones that wrap around you kind of like a back brace. And again, those all have to work together. And then there are muscles of our spine. We're not really talking about the big muscles of our spine that we all know about. There's these little teeny tiny muscles of our spine that run just from one layer to another layer called the multifidi. Those are some of the really key muscles for stabilization because they keep each individual segment of your spine stable. And another piece of our stability of our core is what we do with our breathing diaphragm. Our breathing diaphragm is this muscle that runs up inside here and is responsible when it contracts, it flattens and it pulls down, it pulls air into our lungs, but it also puts pressure into our abdominal space and can be another source of stabilization in that area. So if all of you feel now that, whoa, that's way more complicated than I thought, that's way more than just doing sit-ups, all right, that's the point I was trying to make. We really can't conceptualize stability by thinking about all these individual parts. What we're going to be able to do to help us with stability is be aware of where is our body, and are we keeping our parts stable? So in other words, we need for you to be aware of how your rib cage is sitting in relation to your pelvis. And if you can be aware of your rib cage and your pelvis, then your body, in its natural intelligence about how it all works, which is way beyond our thinking brain, your feeling body can start to figure that out. So that's what we're going to do a little bit of today, is help you figure out how to stabilize. Let your feeling body help you figure that out. So I'm going to move this down just a little bit. All right, we'll see how that is. All right, and this is where I'm hoping you can just go ahead and join me and go through these exercises on your own, together with me. So we're going to start out in this position, which is what I call hook lying, when your knees are sitting in a hook like this. And so the first thing that we're going to do is I want you to think about a little bit about your rib cage, okay? We're going to wiggle it so that you become more aware of where your rib cage is. So can you wiggle it a little up? Feel that gap that you're going to get in your back down here? Can you wiggle it a little bit down and kind of crush it down and feel how then your back will crush into the floor here? Can you wiggle just the left side forward a little bit? Can you wiggle just the right side forward a little bit? Can you expand it with a deep breath? Can you contract it with a large exhale? Okay? So just those few things have allowed you to start to become aware of where your rib cage is. So I'm going to give you just a minute to do that, to do any of those things, to wiggle, to lift, to breathe. And then we're going to come back and talk about the pelvis, but I want you to be really aware of your rib cage before we go to the pelvis. As you wiggle and breathe and move a little bit, you might become more aware of, hey, my rib cage seems like it sits more off to one side than the other. Or you might feel like, it expands more on one side than the other. Or some people might say, my rib cage kind of flares a little bit at the bottom. So let yourself become aware of your asymmetries. So you may or may not be like me, but as soon as I became aware of my rib cage, I started becoming aware of other parts of my body. I ended up adjusting my head a little bit. I'm already starting to adjust into my pelvis a little bit. When we start becoming aware of our bodies take over with their natural intelligence and begin to realize where things aren't right. So we're going to move on from the rib cage and talk about our pelvis, okay? So the pelvis down here can move just as many ways as our rib cage can. So we're going to let you rock your pelvis forward. So if we do that, you'll see you're going to create a little arch in your back. And this doesn't have to be forceful. It can be a very small movement. We're going to rock our pelvis backwards. So that would be like we're going to flatten out this part of our back. And that hasn't been any lifting, just rolling. Like sometimes I think your hips on the floor is kind of like a rocking chair. So you can rock towards the back of your rocking chair legs. You can rock towards the front of your rocking chair legs. So do that for just a little bit. Feel how much movement is there on your pelvis rocking chair. This might vary from person to person. Somebody who's got a lot of back problems, it's pain and stiffness, may only feel comfortable going a little bit on their pelvic rocking chair. Somebody who's young and limber and never had any big back injuries might be able to do a really big motion with their pelvis and not have any discomfort with that. There's no right or wrong here. As you go, I want you to start to try to find, where do you feel like you're balanced right in the middle of that pelvic rocking chair? So you can kind of go back and forth and start to feel out, where is the middle? Okay? So just to add to that, I want you to do just a little bit of rocking side to side. Now, when we rock to side, well, even when we're rocking forward back, what we're really getting is we're actually getting some spine movement, because our pelvis itself is pretty solidly fused together by very, very strong ligaments. So it typically moves mostly as a unit. So when we do a little bit of side to side rocking, again, this is really rotation in our spine, but do a little bit of that. And then I want you to settle in where you feel like you have equal weight bearing on both sides of your tush. And you might realize as you did this that you actually were not bearing weight evenly through both sides of your tush. Okay? Now there's yet another motion I want you to do when you've got that all nice and balanced. And that is now we're going to rock the pelvis like you're turning a steering wheel. So okay, here's the steering wheel is facing the ceiling, right? Okay? So if you bring your left hip up towards your rib cage, you've turned the steering wheel towards the left. And then if you bring your right hip towards your rib cage, you're turning your steering wheel towards the right. So you're going to do just a little bit of steering that steering wheel, right? Left and right, left and right. And then just like all the other ones, you want to kind of come and settle in the middle. And again, you might realize that, oh, I didn't even realize that I was holding my steering wheel turned towards the left. And we want to get that space between your ribs and your pelvis to even out and to balance out. So those three motions, you might want to come back and play with each of them just a little bit when you do this exercise. Rocking your pelvis rocking chair, front and back, find the middle, side to side, find the middle. And are you balanced with your pelvis relative to your rib cage? Now we've gotten that, feeling like we've got all of those midpoints. Let yourself sink into the floor. Now I want you to think about the relationship between your rib cage and your pelvis. Because now we should have everything in as good of alignment as we can achieve. And I'm going to give you a new visual here, okay? I showed you our little skeleton, and how this is our abdominal muscles, or our core is in here. So besides stabilizing our posture, the important part of this area here is also protecting our internal organs. So if we think about that space between our rib cage all the way down to our pelvis, if we were to take all those internal organs out for a second, we'd have a space big enough that I could have this 2-liter bottle inside that area. I could have that coming up inside my ribs and down into the pelvis. So just imagine that space inside of you for a second where you could house a bottle. Actually, it would be bigger than a 2-liter bottle if we filled in all of that space up into the rib cage and down into the pelvis. But of course, that isn't empty space. It's space that's jam-packed with organs where everything is held in its place by fascia and ligaments, of course, as well. But now that you have kind of that sense of that cylindrical space, I want you to think about the bottom of your bottle, okay? So the bottom of your bottle would come all the way down here. Of course, it's not up on top of the inside. It comes all the way down to the base of your pelvis, where we have something called the pelvic floor. Now, I didn't mention that at the beginning, but the pelvic floor is also an important part of our core, because the pelvic floor is basically the bottom of the bottle. So if I stood up and I had no bottom on my bottle, then what's going to happen? Everything falls out, right? Okay? So we have ligaments and we have fascia that all hold our organs and everything in place. But it's also really important that we have this pelvic floor with muscles engaged so that we have a floor on our core, okay? So I'm going to take the bottle away, but I want you to kind of keep that imagery of there being a bottle inside your body from your rib cage down into your pelvis. And I want you to think for a second that you're going to put the bottom on the bottle. So you're going to kind of engage the muscles that cross over in the bottom of your pelvis. You're going to give yourself that sense of connection. So think about those muscles connecting across your pelvis. And then I want you to think about gently lifting and just placing the bottom of the bottle on that bottle that you're imagining in your core. Okay? So that's what I like to have people do when they engage their pelvic floor. Now that's very different than sometimes when people think, okay, I gotta strengthen those muscles. Well, you could do a couple things wrong when you try to strengthen those pelvic floor muscles. The one thing we wouldn't want to do is brace. So if you push downward, kind of like you're trying to have a bowel movement, if you push down, you'll feel everything going the opposite direction, like you're trying to bulge the bottom of the bottle. So that is definitely not what we want to do with that pelvic floor. And when I talked before about, more forceful ways of working the core, anybody who's like, ooh, doing the sit-ups, oh, I'm doing the curl-ups. A lot of times what they'll end up doing is they'll actually end up they'll push downward into that pelvic floor with that forceful strengthening. And that is not ideal for a lot of people, especially if they do have some weakness down there, maybe for women who have had childbirth or women who have had abdominal surgeries, that it definitely isn't a great thing for us to be pushing downward into that pelvic floor. Again, like you're bulging the bottom of the bottle instead of putting the bottom on the bottle. So let's go back to that idea of, again, across the bottom of your pelvis, think about making a connection of those muscles between your seat bones. Okay, do you know what I'm talking about when I say that? Can you come down here and kind of know, oh, okay, those are my sit bones. Your pelvic floor sits between those sit bones, and then ahead of that area is where that pelvic floor sits like a bowl. So again, give yourself that sense of connection between the sit bones, and then can we gently lift and put the floor on the bottom of our bottle. Okay, that's why it's called the pelvic floor, right? It's the floor of the pelvis, but it's also the floor of our core area. All right. So you could also call that a Kegel exercise, but a lot of times when people do a Kegel exercise, they're actually, again, a little bit more aggressive than this, and that may or may not be the right thing to do for some people. So Kegel is a little bit more like if you're trying to stop the flow of urine. So try that for a sec. Try to stop the flow of urine. Okay. Was that a different feeling than what you were just trying when I talked about putting the bottom on that bottle? For me, it is. When I think about stopping the flow of urine, it's a much more directed contraction in that area of the pelvic floor, as opposed to when I was thinking about that connection and putting that bottom on the bottle, that floor on the bottle. It was a more gentle, but also a more complete sense of engaging that pelvic floor. All right, so that's as far as we'll go with that, but I want you to keep occasionally coming back and checking in. Oh, do I still have the floor on my bottle? Do I still have the floor on my pelvis, or did I lose that sense of connection to that sense of gentle lift? Okay. All right, so just a recheck of everything. Your pelvis, if you wiggle it around, is balanced. Your rib cage, if you wiggle it around, is balanced. And then think, I've got this connection between my ribs and my pelvis, so that if I had a bottle inside of me, which is really all our internal organs, I'm going to protect it. I'm going to protect it by keeping this stable. Now, that means I'm not going to crunch my bottle on one side. I'm not going to crunch my bottle on the other side. I'm going to keep it steady and still. And I'm going to keep everything here and everything here in the same position. Okay, so now we're going to start some movement. So we're going to start with your left leg, or whichever leg you choose to. And I'm going to have you slide that leg slowly out. And you can put your hands right how I am. So you're bridging your rib cage and your pelvis. Okay, you're basically bridging that core. As you slide your leg out, I want you to feel that there's no movement between your rib cage and your pelvis. And if you're like me, I'm a little bit tight through the front of my hip. I can go about here before my pelvis would want to start to move with my leg. Now, when we're doing stabilization exercises, it's important that we stabilize, meaning you're going to stop when your body is no longer able to stabilize. So, slide that leg out. Feel for everything staying still. And feel when you hit the end of your motion where things would have to move in order for you to go further. And that's where you're going to come on back up. So this is not about pure strength, and it isn't about having to do 100 repetitions. It's about teaching your body to have awareness, okay? Because sometimes our body loses awareness, and that's when we start to have injuries, and that's when we start to have pain, okay? Now, quick recheck, because as I did my little body scan, I realized, hey, you know what? I kind of lost that sense of connection in my pelvic floor. So again, I want you to come back, check. Do you still have a sense of connection down there in the pelvic floor? Light and gentle, and that slight lift, so you put the bottom on your bottle. Okay, can you keep that sense now as you slide down and as you slide up? And then you could switch legs. And it's very possible that you're going to find that one side, it feels more difficult to stabilize everything. It may be more difficult to keep that floor on your pelvic floor engaged on one side versus the other. I'm finding it a little more difficult on my right side today. And realize too that you might be able to feel more into your body when your eyes are closed versus when your eyes are open. And also when your head is straight versus if you're like me looking over at the computer, that might also throw things a little out of whack, which might be why my right side feels harder because my left side is turned all the way up to my head. Our body is a whole unit. So when I'm turned up here, it has an impact on what happens elsewhere in my body. Okay? So that's the first stage of this exercise. Now the next stage that you could do, if you're comfortable, now if you have a lot of pain, this might be, that might be all you do. Maybe that's a hard enough exercise and maybe you only go a couple of inches, and that is absolutely okay. But now the next thing I'm going to have you do is you're going to bring your knee out to the side. Okay? So one knee is going to stay facing towards the ceiling. And you're going to be thinking about your rib cage and your pelvis. Engage that connection in the pelvic floor. And bring just one knee out to the side. And you're really paying attention here to what's happening, because your pelvis should not rock with your knee on this exercise. So we're going slowly, we're making sure that your pelvis is staying level. You're going to want to put your hands down on the pelvic bones for this one. I learned this exercise is being called bent knee fallouts. But it's kind of a bad name because the knee doesn't fall out because we're using really good control. Okay? Now you're going to do the right side. So the left knee is going to stay facing towards the ceiling. The right side goes out to the side and your pelvis should stay level. Now, you might be able to go way out to the side and have your pelvis stay level. Or you might just go a couple of inches and find that your pelvis is trying to rock with your leg. Okay? It is not about how far you go. It's about the quality of and what your body is learning from this. Okay? Now, check in on yourself once in a while. I just happened to notice that my ribs started to pop up a little bit and I started to get more of a gap here in my back. That's usually both my ribs and my pelvis. So I'm going to kind of recheck. You might want to do that once in a while. Make sure that you've settled into the ground here. And then go back and do a couple more. Okay. So that's about where we're going to wrap up because this has been kind of a long one. We'll be going about half an hour here by the time we're done. So key points, finding your neutral positions in your rib cage and your pelvis. Gently connecting and engaging, slightly lifting to put the floor on that pelvic floor, right? The floor on the bottle. And then keeping all of these things stable with the legs slide out. And then with a few exercises, knee out to the side. Now, realize that we are not strengthening here in the sense of beefing up muscles, okay? We've got to have more weight and more force and more repetitions for that. But a lot of the strengthening that happens in our body is not because we beefed up muscles. It's because we improved connection. We improved connection between the body and the brain. So there's a fancy name for that that's called neuromuscular re-education. NMR, okay? You don't have to remember that. But I do want you to remember that a huge component of strength is not just how strong the muscles are, but how strong the neural connections. So in other words, the brain and body connection is. And that's what we're doing here is training that brain-body connection so that you're better able to engage all of these muscles when needed to help stabilize you. All right, so that's where we're going to end things today. I hope that you'll come back and join me on Friday. Now, on Friday, I'm going to be continuing basically this same lesson, but I'm going to throw a few slightly more challenging exercises into the mix. So if you practice this a little bit today, you practice it a little bit tomorrow, you'll probably be able to do what we do on Friday. It still isn't all that challenging, but it is a progression. I hope this finds you all healthy and surviving life right now, and I'll look forward to seeing you on Friday.